Frank Delaney carried himself like a man who had everything under control. Neighbors saw him in uniform most mornings, polished shoes gleaming, his posture upright as if he were the embodiment of authority. He spoke politely to other residents, nodded respectfully during neighborhood gatherings, and always presented himself as the kind of father and husband people trusted. On Sundays, he stood with his family on the church steps, his arm resting stiffly around his wife's shoulders, his 2 children dressed neatly by his side. From a distance, Frank appeared to be the model suburban man, living a life free from complication or scandal. Yet behind the doors of his carefully maintained brick house, the weight of secrets pressed against him like a storm waiting to break. Frank was known for being strict, even off-duty. His children obeyed his every command without hesitation. His wife handled the home quietly, and the household ran with the order of a barracks. But beneath that rigid structure was a bitterness no one outside his family ever witnessed. He carried resentment in his chest, fueled by years of hardened beliefs and an underlying prejudice he disguised as discipline. Frank believed in appearances more than honesty. He would smile in public, but at night, when the lights dimmed and his badge rested on the nightstand, the cracks in his carefully built mask began to show. His wife had grown distant, tired of his coldness, and their marriage had become a hollow performance they both maintained for the sake of reputation. Everything changed the summer Maya Johnson arrived. She was young, vibrant, and carried with her an energy that contrasted the stifling silence of Frank's own household. At 24, she had just finished school and was eager to carve out her own independence. She rented the modest house next door, and from the very beginning, her presence unsettled Frank in ways he couldn't explain. He noticed her first while watering the lawn, her laughter carrying across the hedge as she unpacked boxes. He told himself she was nothing more than another neighbor, but his eyes lingered longer than they should have, his thoughts slipping toward places he had always condemned in others. Maya's arrival also sparked something else in him, something far uglier. Though he despised the parts of himself that felt drawn to her, he masked it behind a polite friendliness that others interpreted as neighborly courtesy. He offered to help her with odd tasks, insisted on making her feel safe in the neighborhood, and positioned himself as a man she could rely on. What she never realized was that Frank's attention was not harmless. Behind every smile was an internal conflict, a man torn between his public persona and the desires he had buried for years. As weeks turned to months, the sight of Maya became both a fascination and a torment. Frank told himself he hated what she represented, yet he couldn't look away. He began to feel as though his life, once perfectly balanced, was tilting toward something dangerous. The mask of the respectable officer was still intact, but beneath it, a secret obsession was already growing. It was only a matter of time before the perfect suburban mask he wore so carefully began to crack, and the storm he had kept hidden for years found its first target. Frank's home had become a place of silence and obligation. His wife no longer looked at him with warmth, only with the practiced patience of someone who had stopped expecting change. The children obeyed his rules but avoided his presence whenever possible, sensing the simmering anger he carried. Nights were filled with empty routines, television murmuring in the background, the dull clinking of cutlery at dinner, and the sound of the clock ticking in a house that felt more like a cage than a home. For Frank, the badge that once gave him a sense of power now only reminded him of responsibility he no longer enjoyed. Every patrol shift felt repetitive, every salute hollow. He needed something more, something to remind him that he was alive. Maya became that escape. At first it was small gestures, a wave across the yard, a brief conversation when she collected her mail, a polite exchange of smiles. For Frank, each moment felt sharper than anything he had experienced in years. He started lingering outside longer than necessary, timing his chores to coincide with her comings and goings. The distance between them narrowed slowly until one evening he offered to help fix a loose step on her porch. That single act opened a door neither of them expected to walk through. The visits grew more frequent, cloaked in the quiet comfort of secrecy. Frank told himself he was simply being neighborly, but the rush he felt around her betrayed the lie. When he stepped into her house, he left behind the weight of his family, his rank, and his reputation. He was not a husband, not a father, not an officer, just a man chasing something forbidden. For Maya, the attention was complicated. She knew his reputation in the neighborhood and had heard whispers of his temper, but she also saw the cracks in his armor. His vulnerability, however fleeting, drew her closer. She convinced herself that perhaps he was different in private than the man he appeared to be in uniform. The affair began with quiet encounters, hushed footsteps across the lawn, and lights turned off early to keep suspicions away. What started as stolen moments quickly evolved into a routine. Frank's lies at home became smoother, his excuses more elaborate. He claimed extra shifts, late-night calls, or sudden errands. His wife questioned him at first, but his rigid demeanor silenced her protests. In his mind, the danger of being caught only heightened the thrill. Each meeting with Maya gave him a surge of control, a feeling that he was living outside the boundaries of the life he had built. Yet beneath the rush was a darker truth. Frank's fascination was not rooted in affection, but in obsession. Maya became both a symbol of freedom and an outlet for the frustrations he could no longer manage. He despised the contradiction but refused to walk away. Every secret visit pulled him deeper into a double life, one that grew harder to maintain as his worlds began to overlap. What he saw as his greatest escape was also the very thing tightening a noose around his carefully guarded existence. The balance Frank had fought so hard to maintain began to falter in ways he could no longer control. His neighbors had always been watchful, but now their glances seemed sharper, their smiles more strained. The quiet cul-de-sac was a place where everyone noticed who came and went, and Frank's late-night absences didn't escape attention. People whispered about his car leaving at odd hours, about the light flickering next door when Maya was supposed to be alone. He could sense the suspicion growing around him, even in the way his wife's eyes lingered on him when he returned home smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume. She asked fewer questions now, but the silence she offered carried more weight than accusations ever could. At work, the strain showed in different ways. His colleagues, men who once respected his authority, began to view him as unstable. His temper flared too easily during patrols, and his judgment seemed clouded. A few of them had seen how he looked at Maya when she happened to walk by the station, and though no one said it aloud, they began piecing the puzzle together. Frank had always carried a reputation for being hard and uncompromising, but now there was a reckless edge that even fellow officers found troubling. His reputation as a reliable cop was eroding, replaced by muttered warnings and sidelong glances. Maya, caught in the middle of his unraveling, began to feel the weight of the affair pressing down on her. What had once seemed like a thrilling secret was now tangled with unease. She noticed the intensity in Frank's eyes, the way his grip lingered too long, how his visits felt less like stolen moments of passion and more like demands. Her own dreams, finding a career, exploring the world beyond this quiet neighborhood, felt suffocated by the shadow of his obsession. She considered ending things quietly, slipping out of the relationship before it consumed her, but fear kept her tethered. She didn't fully understand the danger she was in, only that Frank's need for control made the idea of leaving feel risky. The cracks widened each day. Frank's wife discovered inconsistencies in his stories, details that didn't add up. Neighbors grew bold enough to whisper near her, hinting at things she didn't want to hear. The community, once convinced of Frank's polished image, began to view him differently. Even children who once waved at him avoided his gaze. Frank felt the shift like a tightening circle, pressing him into a corner he couldn't escape. His world was closing in, and he blamed Maya for being both the source of his escape and the reason his lies threatened to collapse. Inside his own mind, paranoia took root. He convinced himself that Maya was preparing to betray him, that she would expose everything and ruin him completely. Every unanswered call, every night she chose to stay in rather than see him, fed his spiraling thoughts. What Maya saw as space, Frank interpreted as betrayal. To him, the risk of losing her was not only emotional, it was the unraveling of the life he had built on power, image, and secrecy. And as the pressure mounted, his obsession hardened into something far more dangerous, something that would soon push him beyond the point of no return. The night began like any other, with the neighborhood settling into its usual rhythm. Porch lights flickered on, televisions hummed faintly behind curtains, and the air carried the warmth of early summer. For Frank, however, the quiet only amplified the storm building inside him. He had spent the day stewing in suspicion, convinced that Maya was drifting away from him, maybe even seeing someone else. Every detail, her shorter conversations, the way she avoided his gaze, her recent absence from their usual meetings, fueled his paranoia. By the time the sun set, his thoughts had twisted into certainty. She was betraying him, and if she betrayed him, his entire life would collapse. Frank drove aimlessly for hours, drinking from a flask he kept hidden under his seat. The alcohol sharpened his rage rather than softening it. The stories he told himself grew darker, more dangerous. He imagined her laughing at him, imagined her confiding in someone about their secret, imagined the shame and disgrace that would follow when everyone discovered the truth. The badge he wore would mean nothing. His reputation would be ruined. His family would abandon him. By midnight, he had convinced himself that there was only one way to silence the threat. When he returned to the neighborhood, the street was hushed under a blanket of darkness. He parked his patrol car a few houses down, out of sight, and sat in silence, gripping his service weapon with trembling hands. His breaths came in short bursts, and the pounding of his heart filled the silence of the vehicle. The idea of confronting her had been circling his mind for weeks, but now it solidified into action. He stepped out quietly, moving with the same caution he had learned during years of patrol, only this time he wasn't enforcing the law. He was preparing to break it. Maya's house was still. A dim light glowed from her living room, but the rest of the home was swallowed in shadow. He slipped through the side gate, his footsteps muffled by the grass, and forced the back door open. The sound was small, but to Frank it rang like a thunderclap. Inside, the air was heavy with stillness. He moved through the rooms with familiarity, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, his weapon gripped tighter than ever. He told himself he only wanted answers, but the tension in his body betrayed his true intent. When he found her, the confrontation lasted only moments. Maya barely had time to register his presence before the argument erupted into violence. His voice was low, his movements frantic, his paranoia spilling into accusations she could not fight against. The scene escalated with terrifying speed, years of suppressed anger and obsession exploding in one uncontrollable act. A single gunshot cut through the night, silencing everything in an instant. The neighbors stirred at the sound. Some thought it was fireworks, others froze in fear, unsure of what they had heard. Within minutes, flashing lights and sirens shattered the calm of the cul-de-sac. Officers swarmed the street, unaware that one of their own was the monster they were hunting. Maya lay lifeless in her own home, while Frank sat back in his patrol car only a short distance away, his mind a whirlwind of panic and denial. He rehearsed lies, clung to the hope that his authority might shield him, but deep down he knew the mask had been ripped away. The perfect image he had built was gone, and all that remained was the ruin he had created with a single violent act. The investigation moved quickly, faster than Frank ever imagined it would. The sound of the gunshot had drawn neighbors to their windows, and within minutes patrol cars crowded the street. Detectives swarmed Maya's house, their flashlights cutting through the stillness of the night. They documented the scene, noting the broken door, the signs of struggle, and the unmistakable evidence of a life cut short. It didn't take long for suspicions to fall on Frank. His car had been spotted near the house. His behavior in recent weeks had been erratic, and whispers of his late-night visits had already circulated through the neighborhood. Phone records became the first crack in his story. Investigators traced dozens of calls and late-night texts between him and Maya, proof of a relationship that contradicted the respectable image he had worked so hard to preserve. Surveillance cameras from nearby houses added more weight. Grainy footage showed him approaching her home on the night of the murder, leaving no room for denial. Even the colleagues he once trusted turned their backs as the evidence stacked higher. He had lived by the badge, but now the badge was powerless to protect him. In the days that followed, the media descended on the community. Headlines painted a chilling picture, a decorated officer entangled in an affair that spiraled into violence. News anchors repeated his name with every broadcast, attaching words like obsession, betrayal, and murderer to a man who had once demanded respect. The town that once looked up to Frank now spoke of him in hushed voices, shaken by the realization that the person meant to protect them had become their greatest threat. The courtroom became the stage for his final unmasking. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with methodical precision. The texts, the neighbors' testimonies, the footage, and the forensic proof from Maya's home. Every detail painted Frank as a man consumed by jealousy, unable to accept rejection, and willing to destroy everything to preserve his pride. His defense team tried to argue instability, tried to paint him as a man pushed beyond his limits, but the jury saw through the excuses. The cold facts left no space for sympathy. His wife sat silently in the gallery during the proceedings, her face pale and unreadable. She listened to the details of his betrayal, each word confirming what she had long suspected. When the guilty verdict was announced, she did not cry. She simply stood and walked out, closing the door on the life she had once shared with him. His children would grow up with his name spoken only in whispers, a legacy of shame they had no part in creating. Frank was sentenced to life, stripped of his uniform, his authority, and the image he had clung to for so long. Inside prison walls, he was no longer Officer Delaney or the respected family man. He was just another inmate, haunted by the memory of what he had done. The quiet neighborhood he once ruled through his presence would never forget the night it lost its innocence. The mask had finally shattered, and all that remained was the hollow truth of a man destroyed by his own obsession.